The next case, Janus Capital Group versus First Derivative Traders, a very complex case. Again, a 5-4 majority opened a loophole for corporations to mislead investors and to shunt responsibility for fraud onto subsidiaries who may have been unaware of the deception and don't have any assets to cover the losses anyway. This case is very difficult to describe in less than several minutes, so I won't attempt to do so. Schindler Elevator Corporation versus the United States. This is about the whistleblower laws that established a reward system for folks to blow the whistle on, like, corporations they work for if those corporations are defrauding the United States, the United States government, particularly government contractors. And what this decision said is that, well, you don't get any whistleblower reward if the information that the case was based on came from a federal report. That is, we knew about it. Basically, we knew about it. The federal government knew about it anyway. But in this case, it was someone used a Freedom of Information Act request to develop the information. And I said, well, that's the same thing as a report. You don't get any reward. And of course, the Supreme Court in other ways has eviscerated whistleblower protection, so that anyone who blows the whistle on their own corporation really isn't protected from being fired or even being sued by the corporation that they blew the whistle on. So these seem bad, but as you get into the details, they are even worse. So look at two cases. First of all, the public funding case, Arizona Freedom, FEC, what does that stand for? That's Free Enterprise Club versus Bennett. This slide describes very briefly what the Arizona public funding system does, this system was adopted by initiative about 15 years ago. So if you want to get public funding for your campaign in Arizona, you have to go out and get a certain number of $5 contributions from voters. If you're running for the legislature, it's 200 of them. If you're running for governor, for example, it's 4,000 of them. If you then qualify for public funding, if you're running for governor, you get an initial grant of $707,000 in this cycle. If you're running for the legislature, for example, you get an additional grant of $21,000. Now compare this to the amounts that are spent for these races in Oregon. The last governor's race, the folks spent $20 million. Basically, you're not in the game if you don't have at least $5 million to spend. Arizona, as a state, has a lot larger population than Oregon does, but their publicly funded candidates get $707,000. Their legislative candidates $21,000. In Oregon, a contested House race now, the winner basically spends $700,000, which is 30 times as much. So these, elections in Arizona run on a lot smaller amounts of money.
And if they were not publicly funded in Arizona, do you have an idea? Can you give us an idea how much a privately financed candidate for governor, for instance, would have spent?
I don't have that with me, but it's much, much less, because Arizona has the most stringent limits on private contributions of any state, because it has a formula that involves inflation. But currently, no individual for all statewide races together can contribute more than an aggregate of about $800 in an election cycle.
Really?
In Oregon, it's an infinite amount for each candidacy, for each individual in an election cycle. Also, the same thing is true in legislative races. If you want to support people running for the legislature in a 2-year cycle, if you're any person involved in an Arizona race or contributing to an Arizona race, you can only contribute $800. That's it, and that's for everybody. That's for all the candidates that you want to support.
Wow.
So Arizona has the most stringent limitations on contributions, and of course they ban corporate and union contributions as well.
And the Citizens United case wouldn't affect those?
Doesn't affect the contribution limits, no. In fact, this Arizona FEC case, the majority in the Supreme Court case actually said that, actually went out of its way to validate these low Arizona limits, saying, how do you fight corruption? Well, you don't fight it with this public funding, but you fight it with these Arizona has extremely low limits, and that's what fights corruption. So that is a slight silver lining that even the the majority in the Arizona case went out of its way to validate or praise the extremely low limits on contributions that Arizona had.
Okay.
Now, the feature of the Arizona system that was put into question was that if a privately financed candidate, someone who doesn't opt for public funding, spends more, let's say, than $21,000 that the legislative candidate, publicly funded candidate has, then the Arizona system would match the additional dollars on a dollar-for-dollar basis up to twice as much more, than in this case up to an additional $42,000. Over that, the privately funded candidate can, of course, raise as much money as they can possibly raise under the limits in Arizona, and the publicly funded candidate doesn't get any more than that $21,000 plus $42,000 if they're running for the legislature. Now, the Supreme Court majority agreed that the Arizona system would be valid if it simply made larger initial grants. That if it just made the $63,000 grant in the first place, that would be okay. Instead, the Arizona system made a $21,000 grant and then didn't make the $42,000 grant until and unless the opponents raised money. So basically, the Arizona system attempts to conserve taxpayer money, not spend unnecessary money in uncontested races, for example. But the Supreme Court said, no, if you can't provide more public money in response to the opposing candidate raising money from private sources. So that's a horrible decision, but one that is even worse is ATT mobility versus Concepcion.